So okay, finally we get to do some stuff in ZBrush and add some of the detail to this simple geometry that we made in the previous chapters. So here's our really simple little wife beater we made. I'm just going to export this out to an OBJ. First thing I'm going to do is just kind of paint in some basic wrinkles where I think they should go. What we're going to do with this object is, once we're finished, is take it back into Max to retopologize it, and I don't need to worry too much about making these wrinkles perfect because we're going to do some work in Max too. This is almost like sketching out where we want all this detail to go. And everything else we do is going to be done in Max. So I'm just going to kind of just paint in some basic wrinkles where the shirt might have some tension being pulled upon him from being tucked into his pants. So with cloth you should have some kind of harsh, sharp wrinkles along with some soft wrinkles. So we're just going to start off having a couple wrinkles going down from the chest where he's got a pretty bit large chest, so it should be kind of tense and being kind of pulled tight right there. So moving ahead a little ways, we painted in a couple details, and now we just want to add where the pants get met, so we're going to paint a little bit of wrinkling in there. And some of these wrinkles aren't going to look perfect because we're going to take them back into Max and clean them up a little bit. I just want to get a general sketch of what I want to do. So I open up Projection Master and just drop it, and using the Deco brush, I'm going to draw in some sharp little not actually cuts, some sharp little wrinkles. Helps with that tension of the cloth going over the body there. So we just add a couple more, kind of speed it up a little bit. We just go until we find something that looks kind of good. Then we just go to Pickup. It'll apply all that detail we just did, then we can rotate it and drop it again. Projection Master is a great way to really quickly rough in some, not even rough in actually, to get really fine detail as well as rough in a couple details. So really, it's a great tool to use for cloth wrinkling. Any wrinkling really, but it's really nice for the cloth. If I'm doing something more organic like a character's musculature and stuff, when I first begin I won't go into Projection Master almost at all until I start doing more detail stuff. Which these kind of wrinkles pretty much are just details. So okay, we're going to bring it back into Max now. There it comes. You can see our nice high-res object. It's very high-res, so obviously not going to be workable for us right now. Let's just move this thing off to the side. Actually, just hide the old one. What we'll do is make it see-through so we can kind of see how it's all working together. Now we have a couple options here. We could actually go in and cut all the detail that we just added in ZBrush, which would be kind of insane. And it would take a long time, but we could use it as a sketch. And we'll actually do that later on when we do the scar for the character's head. But what I want to do here is show you how you can take this high-res detail and use polydraw tools to retopologize really quickly and get a very detailed mesh that would otherwise take a much longer time trying to think it out. We can really quickly just think of what we might want to do in ZBrush, maybe spend 15 minutes in there, and then jump into here and build our whole poly model in a lot less time because we already have a pretty good idea of where the wrinkles are going to go, where details are going to go. So yeah, our one option here would be to actually cut all the detail in, which really is just not a lot of fun. As you can see, this would take a long time. I like to have the shade selected faces on when I'm doing stuff with retopologizing because once you're in ghost mode and you start building an empty object, you're going to see here, it's kind of hard to see what you're doing otherwise. But when it's got an edge and you've only got a few faces at first, it really is easy to see where you're going. So we just started a new object using the empty OBJ option. And now we're just going to draw along and just start to kind of trace along all of the detail we painted in ZBrush. And the best way to do that, I usually just start by using the build tool and making one polygon. You do this by clicking four points and then making them into a polygon. And then you go into the border tool and hold shift while you drag along the edges, and it'll actually just kind of sketch along with sketch along with you as you move the mouse. So here I'm just kind of roughing in some of these base little wrinkles that we did in ZBrush. I'm going to go a little slow here so you can kind of see what's going on. I like to have the see-through mode on so I can see right through them. We'll go back into border. So you can see we're just grabbing every other edge because we're going to use the border tool then to just kind of fill in those two. Here we go. Now we're filling in all that detail that was kind of left open on those two. It's almost like drawing two supporting pipes and then drawing the in-between stuff right there. The border tool is great. What you can do here with it is by holding shift and dragging along an edge, you're going to just drag from that edge just like you would do in Max. But by just clicking in between two edges, you'll begin to draw a polygon from there. So you see we started doing that quite a bit when we start having corner edges. So speed things up a little bit more here. Start working on the other side a little bit. Back into this object. Now we're going to use the Poly Topo tool, which we used a little bit before. And here we're just going to kind of sketch in where these wrinkles go. And like I said before, you don't want to go too detailed with these because it does have a little trouble solving sometimes. So what we'll do is we'll just start by building the big wrinkles, and then using the connect and border tools, we'll build in the smaller and finer details. So once we're ready with our Poly Topo, we just right click and it goes and turns itself into a polygon shape. And then by making an edge selection and then converting it over to vertex and moving along the normals, we're able to kind of bulge and shape some of these wrinkles. Then we're going to do the same thing again on some of these the bigger wrinkles really. More of the form defining wrinkles right here. And then I'm just following along where I have the cross sections on the other set of wrinkles. That way it all merges together really cleanly and easily, and I don't have to really have a lot of thought behind it. We've got a lot of the base wrinkles already put in here. You can see it goes pretty fast when you do this. It can take as long as you want. You could actually completely rethink how you laid out your wrinkles in this stage, but you did a decent job in ZBrush, so it's good enough for us to get a pretty quick undershirt. And that's the other thing. This whole shirt right here is only going to be seen underneath a jacket. So we're going to keep using this Poly Topo tool to kind of draw in some of these edges and begin to connect the two sides. And we just draw these swoops along. And you can see that we didn't follow the cross sections all the way up through the belly, and it just kind of left those for dead because it didn't understand that those were going to become polygons. So if you don't tell it what to do, it won't do it. You're really drawing your edge flow here. Then I'm following along with the previous edges I made, and it'll actually connect all of them together, for the most part. It can be a little tricky sometimes, so sometimes you just got to do it by hand. But these tools make it quite fast to do that. So you see, once again, I'm drawing every other edge and then using the border tool to connect in between them instead of trying to draw out every edge. Just makes it a little faster. Then connecting. And then using Control-Alt-Shift, we can go into Move mode and just make sure all these verts are snapping onto the face when we use the Connect tool. Also, we can turn on Set Flow, and that'll do a pretty good approximation, but never perfect. So again, we're going to fade a little bit ahead because we're kind of repeating ourselves a little bit. So here's where we're at. Got most of the base wrinkles in. We've got a little bit of the border of the shape is in there now. Just going to relax some of these wrinkles that I've done because they're a little harsh right now. Now we gotta do a little bit more cleanup on here. And I want to pull some of these wrinkles out and some of these wrinkles in that we've added to make them a little stronger or a little softer in some places. And opening up the loop tools, this one got a little wild, so I'm just going to hit the set flow button, which will kind of figure a nice smooth way for that edge loop to go. And then pulling these out a little bit more. Looks a little CG in some parts, so we're going to keep working on this. I'm going to use the extrude on this and add a couple wrinkles right here. And then relax a few times. A little CG looking, but we're going to clean it up in a moment. Anything that's kind of harsh or unnatural looking, I just say it's CG looking, and that usually means it's not good. Looks fake. Doesn't look right. So when we're doing wrinkles, what we do here is I'll extrude an area, and then I'll unselect kind of the middle area, and then put a lot more relax on the two ends so that it kind of fades as the wrinkle kind of dies off. And then using under the modeling tool in Polyboost, there's a button called Smooth, which will make sure that your whole mesh is displayed as smooth, the smoothing groups. Make sure that you're looking at it all as one smoothing group as opposed to multiple, which can get a little confusing after a while. So we're just going to keep extruding certain edge loops to kind of get a couple harsher, more defined cuts and wrinkles in this shape. And then we're going to clean up some of the hooks that it creates. See here, we're just going to take those middle points and bring them in a little bit. Gotta relax, some of this is just a little too harsh. See, once again, we added a shell modifier to this so we can kind of see how it's going to look as cloth. The whole time you're working on this, you want to keep in mind that this is going to be deforming, so you want to keep your edge flow pretty clean. And you also want to make sure the wrinkles kind of follow with the cloth might wrinkle when he moves around. Though this is an undershirt, so it won't really need as much attention as something that's going to be exposed a little bit more, such as the pants when we get to those. I just want to close off some of this. And this gets a little repetitive, so I think I'll fade ahead a little bit again. In just a moment. Alright. Now we're going to cut in some new stuff that we didn't even paint in ZBrush, just some stuff that I had thought about as we were working. Didn't like the way some of the wrinkles were going across the belly, they seemed a little odd, so we're going to totally remake that area. It's a good stage to start doing that. Just cleaning up some of these parts that didn't turn out as good as we'd hoped. When you cut across geometry, a lot of times it's going to cut your geometry pretty bad, so two options are just dig in and start retopologizing it, or you just delete that whole section and rebuild it. But I think it's far. I think it's close enough that we can just do this by doing a little cleanup. So I want this cut to kind of go across with the belly, and I'll just run an extrude on it. So I kind of drew in where the cut should go, then ran the extrude, and then relaxed it a whole bunch. And now I'm cleaning up these edges where it got a little wacky. Then I want to sharpen that one. Connect a few of these, and then clean up the areas that we don't need anymore. And make sure that the edge flow is still nice and clean. Quads, if at all possible, should always be the rule. Triangles only when needed. Sometimes they pinch in a way that you might like, or they're just in an area that doesn't really matter, so you can kind of hide it. So let's move more verts around. Sharpen some of these edges again. Some of the wrinkles got a little soft, so we just kind of grab the top edge and pull it out a little bit. Same on here. And then run a little bit of relax on the areas that got a little too harsh. And you can see we're already getting a little bit more of a cloth look to it. Definitely pinching in a lot of areas, but that'll go away as we continue to clean this object. Using the soft selection, I'm also making sure these areas that get a little wobbly don't look quite too wild. We just keep cleaning these areas. And using the snap tool when we use connect, I'm going to speed things up a little bit now. So I'm pulling that out a little bit. And we're starting to get some cool little wrinkles here and there. Some areas are looking a little messy, but that's okay. Those are going to go away pretty soon. Most important thing is that it's all pretty clean. So far it's not too bad. There's a couple pulls that I don't like, but it should be alright for now. We still have this whole back section to deal with though. It's an area I know isn't going to be seen too much, so I might even take the old mesh from the low res geometry and just connect it onto there. And we're going to disconnect these points. And you can see I had to make sure that there was a more of a 5-sided polygon there as opposed to I think it had 6 before. So I closed off one edge, and then I could grab those 2 floating verts in the middle of the polygon and use the build end tool, which is a great tool for closing off some random edges. Okay, I want these under the arm folds to be pretty harsh, so add some more of that. It's getting a little repetitive again, so I may kind of jump to the future a little bit here. Let's pull a few more points. You can see we have this whole back section to deal with. So I unhid the old object that we made, the really low-res kind of cage that we used to bring into ZBrush to paint this thing. And I'm just going to duplicate the back area, hide the high-res one, hide the other low-res one. Then I'm going to attach these two, this one that I just retopologized and painted up, and this back piece that's pretty simple. But we're never really going to see this character's back, this part of him, so there's no need for me to go through and paint all those wrinkles if I know that I'm never going to see them. So I just basically weld all that together and take a look to see how it looks, and it's fine. But I can see that some parts are poking through, so we're going to have to fix that. But for the most part, it's looking pretty good. Much better than the other one. Now we just want to make sure that everything is fitting onto the body. And always keep an eye on that reference. And you can see how much of it's not really going to be seen at all. So now it's time to build that jacket. We talked about it a little bit in the last chapter. It's a big part of this character. It takes up a lot of the real estate of his being. So I'm using that poly topo just like we did in the last chapter to kind of rough in the basic form. How these edge loops are going to flow. Where the collar should go. And when I end an edge like that, I just hold shift and continue the edge once I've rotated the camera to a point where I can see where it's going. And then right click and it'll actually make the polygons. And you can see it didn't do a terrible job. It actually just left a few little open holes here and there. So I'm just going to fix that up using the border tool. But it didn't do very good down in the area around his waist because I didn't add enough segments. So I put a push modifier in there instead of a shell right now. And so long as I have no actual object selected, I can see how it's going to look if it's pushed off the object a little bit. So you could use a ghosting method, or you can with displayed edges on, or you can use a shell and make sure that it's on with the modifier being displayed, or you can just use a push modifier too. But the thing with a push is that it is dependent on your selection, so if you have anything selected, it'll only work on those objects. Luckily, Polyboost, when you start dragging stuff, doesn't take into account a selection. So it'll work just fine. There's still a few little sections we need to fix up here. You can see that my selection is being popped out because the push modifier. Which gets a little confusing at this stage. So he's got kind of a vest going on right now. He still needs sleeves and everything else, but that's coming very soon. First thing we do is just kind of duplicate out that cylinder. Oops. Go from a better view so we can see where we're going. And this is going to be a rolled up sleeve too, so we don't need it to go all the way there, but I just want to rough in where this would go. And then clean up some of, there's just too many edges to deal with at this point, so it's kind of a hippie looking thing right now, but we'll get rid of that. Because we're going to do some snapping here, we don't want to have all these edges on there, so once I've hidden all that, and I've still got the man as my surface is drawn in PolyDraw, so when I move these tools, it's actually snapping onto his arm even though it's hidden. And then I'm just going to snap this around where his wrist would be. Just have to kind of keep a visual picture in my head of what this character looked like and where he was, and I don't have to have him actually in the scene while I do this. You can see a few of them went shooting off into space. And then we're just going to cut this because we don't need so much length on the sleeve. So we pull this up to about his forearm area and then snap it into place. It's pretty quick to rough in a whole object at this point. Now it's just a matter of adding a lot of detail. And making sure that all of this is very clean. But first, we're just going to get everything snapped onto the object. Now we can start connecting these edges so that they all line up. Connect those two. That one needed one. Oh, one down here. There's that. And one last edge along there. And then we can finish that edge ring. Or edge loop, excuse me. And then he's got a little bit of a seam where his sleeve is, so make sure we have a little extra geometry there. And we're also, once again, are keeping in mind where the object is going to be moving a lot. So that area is his shoulder area, so we're going to have to add a lot of geometry in there so that he can raise his arms above his head and around his body and whatnot, and have enough geometry to move around without totally stretching the object. Being intelligently clean is what you want to do. It's mostly fitting on there pretty good at this point. Just a matter of making sure that his body is encompassed by the whole thing. It's looking pretty good. His biceps poking through a little bit. And also he still needs a collar, so we're going to start drawing that in. Fading ahead a little bit, you can see we've already got a lot of the collar drawn in. It looks a little invisible because it's facing backwards to the normal of the polygon. But you can follow that line and see where it's going. We're going to detach this so that we can see it a little bit better. You can also turn on backface culling, which would help. But at this stage, we're just going to start in here. Then connecting these points and those. Just want to make sure that everything's kind of connected up with this collar. We put a shell modifier on here too, so once we snap out of element mode, we can actually see what it looks like without having to detach it. You can see we have to pull this out a little bit more. And just kind of rough in the shape. Right now it doesn't matter how exact we get because we're going to change a lot of stuff pretty soon. But just as long as we have a basic collar shape, we're pretty good to go. Make sure it matches up kind of with the concept and has a general look, because pretty soon we're going to take this into ZBrush to both do the proportions and a lot of the details. Okay, so jumping ahead a little bit, we're just going to hide everything that we don't want to export here, and we're just going to bring just the jacket, not the collar itself, but just the jacket, because we're going to really focus on the sleeves and some of the other areas. But here we go. So we bring him into ZBrush, divide it a few times, and just like we did with the undershirt, we're going to start drawing in some wrinkles. And we're going to play with a few different tools in ZBrush while we do this, because this thing actually can be symmetrical, unlike the other shirt. It's far enough away from some of these details that we're doing that we can get away with having some symmetry on it. So we start off by working on the underarm, getting a little bit of wrinkling going on there. And as soon as the computer wakes up a little bit, start adding a little bit of the form of it too. Because once we topologize this whole thing, we'll be able to have a really nice clean version of the jacket that we made, but still have all the detail we want. So in ZBrush we want to make sure that we paint in all that detail. So I'm painting kind of like a shoulder pad look here. Some of the seams we're going to paint in. All the wrinkles that we want. All the wrinkles that really matter, because this thing won't be cloth simmed since it's a short sleeve jacket, and then there's a belt around the waist. If you were going to make a piece of cloth like this, or even a jacket or a cape, whatever, and you were going to do it for animation, you want to, and you guys use a cloth sim in your pipeline, all of this would not be necessary, because what you'd want to do is just build a very evenly quadded mesh that was really easy for them to run the cloth sim on. All these wrinkle details, you really only maybe draw in a little bit here and there, but you want to make sure that most of that's driven by the software and not by the artist, because when it starts to move around, if you've painted in and hard baked some wrinkles and then his body moves in a way that those wrinkles just wouldn't exist, it just looks very strange. So make sure that you know that you aren't going to be having a solution for cloth simming before you start doing all this nonsense. But if you've got a character that's going to be baked, which for a lot of game cinematics that kind of comes into play, because you just don't have the budgets to run cloth sim on every single character. And it's a lot of fun to actually draw this wrinkle stuff and look at reference and make sure it all kind of has a natural feel to it. It's good practice for any artist to try and work on getting good cloth folds and make sure it looks like it's actually fitting over anatomy. So in ZBrush right now we're just drawing with the standard brush tool, painting in some stuff with the add and subtract, and then smoothing it out to make sure we don't have too much lumpiness. And then right here we're going to start drawing in the seam. The seams are important to make sure that they're pretty well defined. These are a lot thicker than we're going to make them actually in Max, but it'll be really easy for us to see where they go. So that's the most important thing at this stage. I want to add a little bit more wrinkles here and there. And this is going to be an area we have to do a lot of work to. We want to make sure that this looks like it's really rolled up sleeves. We started by painting some of the crevices. And I'm kind of just looking at the overall thing. I'm not just working on one little area because I want to make sure it all kind of fits together. So if you just focus on one area, kind of the old saying, can't see the forest through the trees kind of comes into play, where you kind of lose sight of the overall look of your character. So I like to just kind of work a little area, spin around, work a little area, spin around, look at it upside down, look at it from the sides. And then his collar is going to go along this, so I don't need to worry too much about the detail here. And so kind of the last thing before we take this guy back into Max, I want to talk about using the layer brush when doing cloth. Sometimes it gives it a nice cloth feel to use that paint one line and then smooth on one side but not the other. You can see that it kind of adds a bit of a harsh crease on one side and not the other. You can see we've got a lot of the detail that we need. Last thing to do here is just mask this off and add a little bit more detail here and there, especially around where the shoulder or where the shirt got bunched up. We need a little bit harsher. Even though I'm going to do a lot of this in Max, I still want to kind of define it in the ZBrush sketch before I take it back into Max. And just we run the Smart Resim, make sure that both sides are symmetrical, and take it back into Max. And you notice on something like this, it's kind of a dense object, so when I'm actually using the PolyDraw tools, they're not showing up. They're going real slow, and maybe I'm getting like half the line that I actually paint. And so it comes to a point where you realize you're going to have to break this up a little bit. So if you're doing something really high-res, say you're making a creature or a really high-res head that you painted, spent a lot of time on, or maybe a sculptor spent a lot of time on, and then you were retopologizing it, what you want to do is run the optimize on the object, which it keeps most all the detail that you want, it just gets rid of all the extra polygons. And then also just take that piece that you're going to be working on and hide the rest. So now you'll see pretty much back to real time with our editing. And when you get to this kind of stuff, if it's not real time, you will go crazy. It just takes a lot out of you. So we did a lot of this on the last object with the vest, and we kind of traced along the main wrinkles, like we're going to do right here, and then kind of filled in the valleys after we traced this in. See how this looks. Okay, looks pretty decent. And just split along the middle because I want to keep some of these pretty harsh. Using the Swift Loop tool, all you have to do is click on an edge ring and it'll add a loop. And if you have the set flow option on, it'll actually keep what it would think your mesh would look like subdivided and make sure that it actually moves all the verts into place. It's a great little tool. It'll save you a lot of time. Especially if you're working on a character and you have good edge loops and you realize, oh no, I need to add more detail to an animation area. Instead of having to worry about how it's going to mess up the shape of your character when you add these loops, it'll actually pretty much solve it for you. So just as we did before, we're going to use the border tools to fill in some of these valleys and to continue drawing along these little wrinkles here and there. Move these points a little bit. So jumping ahead a little bit, you can see we've done this for most of all the wrinkles now. We're just filling in some more of these little crevices. When you're making these wrinkles, you want to kind of make sure that when you're drawing along them, that you're keeping at least one part of the edge on the high point and then one part on the low point. Once again, we're going to use that Polytopo tool, which you can fill in large areas really fast with if you're smart about it. You can see some areas. If you draw too fast with it, it sometimes won't work as well. So be controlled. And holding Shift, we can continue those lines that we didn't draw far enough. And then we can just right-click, and it'll make a little polygon shape. Filled in a nice gap right there. And then some parts that don't get filled in, you just got to use that border tool or any tool that you're more comfortable with and fill those in. And then once again, using the Polytopo, we'll fill in another big chunk right here. It's really just a great way to fill in big areas instead of having to just draw them or snap them on there. As long as you keep a good eye about what it's actually doing. I know right here we want a little bit more of a kind of a shape or whatever, so we're just going to split that and use the build edge tool. Alright, so we've pretty much got the whole sleeves done. I have a symmetry on there so we can see both of them. Works really well. Unhide what we've done. Take a look at where we're at. We've still got a lot more of the jacket to do, obviously. Want to get rid of that really high-res one and start working on the actual part that wraps around the body now. So we painted in a little bit of details already, just like we did in the previous one. I'm going to start dragging these edges. Gets a little bit repetitive after a while, but you know, once you the things to keep in mind and to keep fresh with are just like how the topology is going to flow and enhancing the stuff you did in ZBrush and making sure that everything you did is going to be really easy for animation and also for yourself when you start doing UVs. Satisfying when you make a model that's really clean and also has a lot of detail to it. They're jumping ahead a bit again. We started filling in some of the seam areas. We've got most of the jacket roughed in right now. And it's time to start closing in some of these gaps. And adding more detail when we need it. You can see once again using that border tool and grabbing in between two edges, you're able to draw out polygons. Or just grabbing from one edge and holding shift, you're able to kind of continue along a polygon, a poly loop. Right there, just grabbing between those two edges, and then we're just going to fill in that gap right there by holding Control and Shift. And then continuing on where the seam would go. So jumping ahead a little bit, we've now completed the jacket. Doing just like we were doing earlier, just following along the seams and looking at our ZBrush sketch and then enhancing the areas that maybe I didn't do enough or I got my wrinkles wrong in the sketch and making sure that it all just looks kind of good. Now we can kind of see that we've got a nice undershirt, and we've also got a jacket, and now we just got to make sure it all fits together. You can see the undershirt got a little pushed into the body, so we want to make sure that we clean that up before we move on to the next section. Because it can be a bit of a hassle if you wait too long to fix this stuff, and when you keep jumping back and forth between software and rebuilding stuff, it's pretty easy to lose sight of how everything fits together. So now we're going to work on the pants. We just jump into ZBrush with these. Set it to a color that's a little bit more pleasing to the eye. I never really like that white color that they just default to. It's kind of hard to see things, and I also like to add a little bit of specularity to the material. So if we just start painting in some of these details, some wrinkles in the crotch area. Just kind of look at your own pants or get reference of some friends. Or just start staring at people with baggy pants all the time. And I'm sure they'd really appreciate you staring at their crotch to see how the wrinkles go. Just tell them you're a CG artist. So now we're just going to keep working on the kind of the wrinkles where the shoes get tucked into the pants there a little bit. And we also want to work a little bit on the form, so we're going to work on some of the knees and underlying muscle structure, but they're pretty baggy pants. And once again, these are just sketches. These are something we're going to take into Max again and retopologize and make the real wrinkles in there. This is just kind of a good idea for us to start with, and it's really easy for us to use as a reference instead of just trying to figure it out poly by poly or doing splitting edges and whatnot. Get a much cleaner mesh and have a lot more control over what it looks like. So we've got a lot of wacky wrinkles going on in these pants. Not exactly thrilled with them, but we've got some pockets drawn in, and where the knees there should be some tension around that area. Once again, these aren't going to be, we're not going to be spending too much time making these perfect because we're just using them as a guideline. You could spend a long time making something just the way you want it and then bring it into Max and recreate it almost exactly with a lot less polygons in a fairly short amount of time, but I just, that's something that every project, it's dependent on how much you really want to put into it. So then we're just going to drop down into projection master mode and using the deco brush and a nice soft fall off on the alpha, we'll start painting in some wrinkles. Kind of like we did with the jacket. A little more curvy, flowing a little bit more with how they might wrap around the legs. There we go. So we've got a lot of detail in these pants now. You can see some of his muscle underneath and his knees, and it feels like there's something underneath there. Good enough for me to be just about happy with it. Still needs one last thing, which is a pretty defined seam. We have a little bit of one drawn in, but I don't think it's enough to take into max and really see it, especially when we're in that optimize on it. So I'm going to carve in a pretty harsh one, and I have it on double-sided, so when I pick it back up, it's going to project right through the object onto the other side. And then some of these little wrinkles where the seam might kind of pull some tension on the pants. Alright, a little bit more of those wrinkles that we were talking about. Once again, doesn't have to be perfect because we're just using this as a sketch. It's going to be a little guideline. Really shouldn't be spending much more than maybe 15 minutes in here. So now that we're done, we're bringing it back into max like we've done previously. Going to put the optimize modifier on it. You can see we lose a little bit of the detail that we added, but for what we need it for, it's just fine. I'm actually a little spoiled by these tools now. It's hard for me to just build something poly by poly. It's more thinking than I'm really liking. I like to do a lot of the sculpting in ZBrush and then just have this be kind of the technical aspect. Almost like the UVs to doing textures. You gotta do the technical stuff to have the fun. But if you learn a couple tricks, this stuff goes really fast. You can rebuild a whole character in, you know, a matter of hours as opposed to days. So here we're just going to keep, just like we did with the previous stuff, we're going to use the border tool, the polytopo tool, the connect tool, and we're just going to sketch along where the wrinkles go. We want to make sure that we have the crevices have verts in them, and also that the top parts have a vert on them. So you can see where we're drawing these little polygons along. I'm trying to make sure that at least one part is on the highlight, and one part's on the low light little crevice area. So then fading ahead a little bit, putting a smooth on this and a symmetry so we can see how it looks on both sides. And then jumping ahead a little bit again. Gonna do this a couple of times just to kind of show kind of a time lapse between how fast you can build this. It just seems to be a little repetitive to keep showing it. Because really what we're doing here is we're drawing along the edges that we did, and I think you get the idea there. And the next part is making sure that we go along the seams and make sure that it's nice and easy for us to extrude and chamfer those areas. And also make sure that there's enough of deformable areas in areas like the knees and the waist and hips and stuff. So just kind of important areas to keep focus on a topology. So there's a quick render of what we've done so far. See, it looks like there's a lot more to do, but we got a lot of detail in there all of a sudden. It's much less polygons than you would have to deal with if you just did stuff in ZBrush first. So now we're just going to keep adding some more stuff here. And once again, really focusing on when we get to the seam to make sure it's nice and clean. So I'm cleaning up all this because it got a little weird in there. I want to keep that almost like a flat edge loop when I go along here. Then I can just do a quick edge loop selection and then extrude and make a seam much easier that way. So here's jumping ahead a little bit. I'm going to sketch in some of the pocket area now. Want to make sure I can fold this into itself and keep a nice look of a pocket, even though he's going to have pouches covering a lot of this area. So once again, it's a place that I'm not going to see too much, and I'm just not going to worry too much about. Didn't have enough geometry there, so I'm just going to kind of add a little bit more. And to keep away from that kind of diapered, pantied look, I want to make sure that the flow goes around his waist instead of just going right around the legs, which you'd expect to do, but a lot of times when we do that and the character starts walking, it kind of looks like he's bunching up in the hips and looks a little strange. We just want to keep adding, especially in this area. This is the knee area, so we want to make sure there's plenty of geometry for when he bends his knees for this stuff to bulge out and and keep its form too. I'm going to speed stuff up a little bit here. Just working, making sure all these areas are filled in. I decided not to do the interior seam, I just wanted it on the outside, so I'm kind of going over a lot of that area. I probably should have kept it on there because when you start doing UVs, having an area that's a definable seam like that is really nice. But I didn't keep it, so it's just something I'll have to deal with later on. Luckily I have some good little tricks for doing UVs really quick and clean, so I won't have to worry too much about that. I want to work on the butt a little bit. And so pretty much that's it on the retopologizing of a character. You've seen that we just basically take it into ZBrush and get to sculpt however we want it to look, and then bringing it back into Max, we're able to kind of just paint along with what we did. And at that's pretty much it. So I'll just leave you with just those thoughts, and if you ever want to check out like what you have from the old previous versions, you can kind of take almost like a look down memory lane of the different versions we've done, from the new retopologized pants to the original low polygon pants to the high-res pants that we imported. And there's our character. You can see he's got a lot more detail. He's starting to look a lot more like a finished cinematic character, but we still have a lot more to do too. So I'll see you next chapter.